Kixtal checked his plasma rifle for the third time in 10 minutes. The weapon felt heavy in his four-fingered hands, but its weight was comforting. He had carried this same rifle through 12 battles across 3 star systems. It had never failed him, just like his training and his warrior's instincts. The transport ship hummed around him as it flew through space toward their target. Kixtal looked around the main cabin at the other soldiers. There were 6 different alien species on this rescue mission, and he knew most of them by reputation. The Zelkans with their thick armor plates and powerful claws, the Morphids, who could change their skin color to blend with any background, the tall Rixans with their 4 arms and lightning-fast reflexes, all proven warriors, all worthy allies. Then his eyes fell on the humans. Kixtal tried not to show his disappointment, but it was hard. The humans sat quietly in one corner of the transport, 5 soldiers who looked nothing like the fierce warriors of legend. They were small compared to most species, with soft pink skin and no natural weapons. No claws, no armor plates, no venomous fangs. Just smooth skin and tiny teeth that looked better suited for eating plants than fighting wars. The human leader was a male called Captain Do-hyun. He was maybe 6 feet tall, which was short by galactic standards. His hair was black and cut very short. His uniform was plain gray with simple patches that showed his rank. When he spoke to his team, his voice was calm and quiet. Kixtal had to strain his enhanced hearing just to catch the words. The other humans were even less impressive. There was a female called Private Hay-Wan who carried a sniper rifle that looked too big for her small frame. She was barely 5 and a half-feet tall and couldn't weigh more than 120 pounds. How could someone so tiny handle the recoil from a high-powered weapon? Sergeant Taman was supposed to be their explosives expert. He looked young, maybe in his 20s by human standards. He spent most of the flight checking small devices that Kixtal assumed were bombs. His hands moved with careful precision, but there was nothing threatening about him. He reminded Kixtal more of a technician than a warrior. Corporal Minho was their medic. He was quiet and kept reading from a datapad, probably studying medical files. Private Jin Woo handled communications and seemed nervous. He kept checking his radio equipment and muttering to himself in the human language. What really confused Kixtal was how the humans prepared for battle. Every other species on the transport was doing what warriors should do. The Zelkans were sharpening their claws on metal plates. The Morphids practiced their camouflage skills. The Rixans tested their weapons and checked their armor, but the humans just sat there talking quietly to each other. They passed around small objects, photos, pieces of jewelry, things that looked personal. Private Hay-Wan showed the others a picture of what might have been her family. Sergeant Tai-Min had a small metal charm that he rubbed between his fingers. Captain Do-hyun wrote something on a piece of paper, folded it carefully, and put it in his pocket. It all seemed very unprofessional to Kixtal. These were supposed to be elite soldiers, but they acted more like civilians going on a trip. Where was their battle rage? Where were their weapons checks and combat preparations? How could they stay so calm when they were about to face the most dangerous enemy in the galaxy? The Devourers were not just another hostile species. They were a nightmare that had destroyed 3 colonies already. The creatures were part of a hive mind that shared thoughts and coordinated attacks perfectly. They were 12 feet tall with natural armor and acid weapons. They could tear through steel with their claws and could survive in almost any environment. Worse yet, they didn't just kill their enemies. They consumed them, breaking down biological matter to feed their hive and create new warriors. Every person they captured made them stronger. Every world they conquered gave them more resources to spread across the galaxy. The distress signal from Kepler 442c had been weak and broken, but the message was clear. The mining colony was under attack. Hundreds of civilians were trapped or dead. The local defense forces had been overwhelmed in hours. This was exactly the kind of mission that required the best warriors from across the galaxy. Kixtal was proud to be chosen for such an important task. His people, the Vorthax, had a reputation as honorable fighters who never retreated from battle. He had trained his whole life for missions like this, but looking at the humans, he wondered if the Galactic Council had made a mistake. Maybe they needed the humans for some technical reason he didn't understand. Maybe their small size would help them move through tight spaces in the colony buildings. Or maybe the Council was just being polite by including them in the mission. Either way, Kixtal decided he would keep an eye on them during the fighting. It would be embarrassing if the human squad got themselves killed because they weren't ready for real combat. He had heard that humans were brave enough, but bravery without skill usually just meant dying quickly. The transport's communication system crackled to life. All squads, prepare for landing. We'll reach Kepler 442c in 30 minutes. Remember, this is a rescue mission. Get in, find the survivors, and get out before the Devourers can organize a full response. Around the cabin, the various alien species began their final preparations. Weapons were loaded, armor was checked, and battle plans were reviewed one more time. Kixtal noticed that the humans finally started to move with more purpose. But even their combat preparations seemed strange to him. They didn't test their weapons or practice attack formations. Instead, they gathered in a small circle and spoke in low voices. It looked almost like they were praying or performing some kind of ritual. Captain Do-hyun placed his hand in the center of their circle, and the other 4 humans put their hands on top of his. They said something together in their own language, too quiet for Kixtal to hear. Then they separated and began checking their gear with the same calm efficiency they had shown during the entire flight. Kixtal shook his head and focused on his own preparations. He had his rifle, his sidearm, his knife, and enough ammunition to fight for hours if necessary. His armor was in perfect condition, and his combat instincts were sharp from years of training and battle experience. Whatever happened on the planet, below, he was ready for it. He just hoped the humans could keep up and stay out of the way when the real fighting started. The Devourers were not going to show mercy to anyone, especially not to soldiers who seemed more interested in sharing personal stories than preparing for war. The landing was rough. The transport shook as it broke through the atmosphere of Kepler 442c, and Kixtal could hear the pilot fighting to control their descent. Through the small windows, he caught glimpses of the planet's surface below, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The mining colony had been completely transformed. Where there should have been clean metal buildings and organized work areas, there was now a twisted landscape of organic growth. Thick, rope-like structures covered everything like veins. The buildings that were still standing had been changed into something alive and pulsing. It looked like the entire colony had been infected by some horrible disease. "By the gods," whispered one of the Zelkan warriors. "What did they do to this place?" Captain Do-hyun was looking out the window too, but his expression never changed. He just nodded to himself as if he had expected this. "Standard Devourer conversion pattern," he said in that same calm voice. "They're turning the infrastructure into hive material. We probably have 6 hours before the process is complete." Kixtal was surprised that the human knew so much about Devourer tactics. Most soldiers learned about them through military briefings, but Do-Yun spoke like someone who had studied them for years. The transport touched down at the edge of what used to be the colony's main landing pad. Now it was covered in the same organic material that had spread across everything else. The substance looked wet and moved slightly, as if it was breathing. "Everyone out," ordered the mission commander, a veteran Zelkon named Thokvar. "Stay, in formation, and watch for movement. The Devourers know we're here." The rear door of the transport opened with a hiss, and immediately the smell hit them. It was sweet and rotten at the same time, like flowers left to decay in the sun. Kixtal's nose wrinkled in disgust, and he heard several other soldiers make sounds of revulsion, but the humans showed no reaction at all. They stepped off the transport and immediately spread out into a defensive formation. Their movements were smooth and professional, nothing like the uncertain behavior Kixtal had expected. The landscape around them was even worse up close. The organic material covered everything in thick layers. What had once been roads were now tunnels lined with pulsing walls. The buildings had been hollowed out and filled with some kind of cocoon structures. Worst of all, some of those cocoons were still moving. "There are people in there," said Corporal Minho, the human medic. He was looking at the nearest building through some kind of scanning device. "Life signs are weak, but stable. They're being kept alive." "For how long?" asked Thokvar. "Hard to say. The Devourers like to take their time with the digestion process. Could be days or weeks." Kixtal felt sick. The idea of being slowly consumed while still alive was the stuff of nightmares. He looked at the human medic with new respect. It took steady nerves to discuss something so horrible without showing emotion. The rescue team began moving toward the center of the colony, where the strongest life signs were coming from. Kixtal stayed close to his Vorthak squad mates, but he found himself watching the humans more and more carefully. They moved differently than he had expected. There was no wasted motion, no nervous energy. Private Haywan carried her large sniper rifle like it weighed nothing, and her eyes were constantly scanning for threats. Sergeant Taemin examined the organic structures they passed, sometimes making notes on a small device. Private Jin Woo maintained constant communication with their transport and the orbital ships above. When they reached the first major intersection, the Devourers finally showed themselves. The attack came without warning. 3 of the creatures burst through what had looked like solid wall material, their claws extended and acid dripping from their mouths. They were even bigger than Kixtal had expected, each one nearly 12 feet tall and covered in natural armor that looked like black metal. The Zelkan warriors reacted first, raising their weapons and firing. Their plasma shots hit the creatures but barely slowed them down. The Morphids tried to use their camouflage to get behind the Devourers, but the creatures seemed to know exactly where they were. That's when Kixtal saw what the humans could really. Private Haywan's rifle boomed 3 times in rapid succession. Each shot hit a different Devourer in what looked like exactly the same spot, a small gap where the creature's head armor met its neck armor. All 3 creatures dropped instantly, their heads nearly severed. "How did you know about that weak spot?" Thokvar asked, staring at the dead Devourers. "Standard anatomy," Haywan replied, already scanning for new threats. "All armored creatures need flexible joints. The neck joint is always the most vulnerable." Kixtal realized that the small human female had just accomplished something that should have been impossible. Those shots required perfect accuracy and an understanding of Devourer biology that most soldiers never learned, and she had made them look easy. As they continued deeper into the colony, the attacks became more frequent. The Devourers seemed to be testing their defenses, sending small groups to probe for weaknesses. Each time, the combined alien forces fought them off, but Kixtal noticed that the humans were doing more than their share of the work. Sergeant Tae Min had an almost supernatural ability to predict where the Devourers would attack next. He would place small explosive charges in areas that seemed randomly chosen, but when the creatures burst through those exact spots, the explosions would kill them instantly. Corporal Minho treated wounded soldiers from all species with skill that amazed everyone. When a Zelkan warrior took acid damage to his arm, the human medic used techniques that none of them had seen before. The wound was completely healed in minutes instead of hours. Private Jin Woo seemed to understand the Devourer communication patterns better than their own intelligence experts. He intercepted their signals and translated them, giving the team advance warning of attacks, but it was Captain Do Hyun who impressed Kixtal the most. The human leader made tactical decisions that went against everything Kixtal had learned in military school, but they worked perfectly every time. When logic said to go around a heavily defended area, Do Hyun led them straight through it. When standard procedure called for a careful advance, he ordered a rapid assault. Somehow he seemed to understand how the Devourers thought better than they understood themselves. "How do you know so much about them?" Kixtal finally asked during a brief rest period. Do Hyun looked at him with those calm human eyes. "We've been studying them since the first colony attack. Humans are good at understanding predators. But you've never fought them before." "No," Do Hyun agreed. "But we fought things like them." Kixtal wanted to ask what he meant by that, but alarms started sounding from Jinwoo's communication equipment. The human's face went pale as he listened to the signals. "Captain," he said urgently, "I'm picking up massive movement from the center of the colony. The Devourers are mobilizing everything they have. Something's got them scared." Do Hyun smiled for the first time since the mission began, and Kixtal felt a chill run down his spine. There was something about that smile that seemed dangerous. "Good," the human captain said. "That means we're close to something important. Time to see what they're really protecting." The deeper they went into the colony, the stranger everything became. The organic walls were thicker now, pulsing with a rhythm that reminded Kixtal of a giant heartbeat. The air was humid and warm, filled with spores that made breathing difficult for most species. But the humans seemed unaffected, moving through the thick atmosphere as if it was perfectly normal. The tunnels began to branch and split, creating a maze that would have confused any normal rescue team. But Private Jin Woo had been mapping their route since they entered the colony, and somehow he knew exactly which path to take. "Left here," he would say, or "This tunnel leads to a dead end." He was always right. Kixtal couldn't understand how the small human could navigate so perfectly through an alien structure. When he asked, Jinwoo just shrugged and said, "It's like any other maze. You just have to think like whatever built it." The first major ambush happened when they were about 2 miles into the colony. The team was moving through a large chamber that had once been some kind of processing facility. Now it was filled with hanging cocoons, each one containing what looked like a human or alien colonist. "There!" Corporal Minho pointed to a cluster of cocoons that were glowing slightly. "Those ones still have strong life signs. We can save them." But as they moved toward the survivors, the walls around them exploded inward. Dozens of Devourers poured into the chamber from hidden passages, more than they had faced at any one time. These weren't the smaller scout forms they had been fighting. These were full warrior-class creatures, each one equipped with natural weapons that could cut through steel. The alien soldiers formed a defensive circle and began firing, but there were too many enemies. The Devourers moved with perfect coordination, sharing information through their hive-mind connection. Every time the defenders tried to establish a firing position, the creatures adapted and attacked from a new angle. That's when Kixtal saw something that changed everything he thought he knew about humans. The 5 human soldiers didn't join the defensive circle. Instead, they scattered throughout the chamber, each one moving to a different position. To Kixtal, it looked like they were abandoning their teammates and trying to save themselves. But then he realized what they were really doing. Private Haywan had climbed up into the hanging cocoons, using them as cover while she picked off Devourers with precision shots. But she wasn't just shooting randomly. Each shot was carefully planned to create maximum chaos among the creatures. When she killed one Devourer, its body would fall and knock down 2 others. When she destroyed a creature's sensory organ, it would thrash around and damage its allies. Sergeant Taman was moving through the chamber like a ghost, placing explosive charges in spots that seemed completely random. But when they detonated, the explosions created a chain reaction that brought down entire sections of the organic ceiling, crushing groups of Devourers and blocking their attack routes. Corporal Minho had abandoned his medical role entirely. He was using his knowledge of anatomy to target specific nerve clusters on the creatures, paralyzing them with small, precise weapons. Each shot disabled a Devourer without killing it, creating obstacles that the other creatures had to climb over. Private Jinwoo was doing something even stranger. He had hacked into the Devourer communication system and was sending false signals. The creatures began attacking each other, confused by orders that contradicted what they could see with their own eyes. But it was Captain Do-hyun who made Kixtal's blood run cold. The human leader was moving through the battle like he was dancing. He dodged claws that should have torn him apart, slipped between creatures that should have crushed him, and struck at weak points that he shouldn't have been able to see. His movements were fluid and graceful, but there was something predatory about them that reminded Kixtal of the great hunters from his own homeworld. Every move Do-hyun made served multiple purposes. When he rolled under a Devourer's claws, he also planted an explosive charge on its leg. When he leaped over an attacking creature, he fired shots that weakened the ceiling above a group of enemies. When he seemed to retreat from one area, he was actually herding the Devourers into a killing zone that his team had prepared. The battle lasted only 10 minutes, but when it was over, 43 Devourers were dead or disabled. The alien soldiers had killed maybe 6 of them. The rest had been eliminated by the 5 humans, working with a coordination that rivaled the creature's own hive mind. How? Thakvar asked, staring at the carnage around them. How did you do that? Captain Do-hyun was reloading his weapon, his face calm as if nothing unusual had happened. We've had practice with pack hunters, he said simply. Kixtal didn't understand what that meant, but he was beginning to realize that he had seriously underestimated these creatures. The humans weren't just soldiers. They were something else. Entirely. As they continued toward the center of the colony, the attacks became more desperate. The Devourers were throwing everything they had at the rescue team, but somehow the humans always seemed to be one step ahead. They anticipated every ambush, countered every tactic, and adapted to every new threat faster than should have been possible. It's like they can read the creatures' minds, one of the Morphid soldiers whispered to Kixtal. But Kixtal was starting to think it was something else. The humans weren't reading the Devourers' minds. They were thinking like them. They understood predator behavior in a way that went beyond military training. When they finally reached the central chamber, what they found was worse than anyone had imagined. The room was enormous, carved out of the living rock and lined with organic machinery. Thousands of cocoons hung from the ceiling, each one containing a colonist in various stages of digestion. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the chamber was something that made even the veteran warriors step back in horror. It was a breeding pit, where the devourers were experimenting with genetic material from different species. They were trying to create new types of warriors by combining traits from humans, Zelkans, Morphids, and dozens of other races. They're not just feeding, Corporal Minho said, his voice tight with controlled anger. They're evolving. Every species they consume makes them stronger and more adaptable. How long before they complete the process? Thokvar asked. The human medic ran his scanner over the breeding pit and its contents. His face went pale. At this rate? Maybe 6 hours. Once they perfect the combination, they'll be able to reproduce faster and adapt to any environment. Kickstail felt a chill of absolute terror. If the Devourers succeeded in their experiment, they wouldn't just be another hostile species. They would be unstoppable. They would consume everything in the galaxy. We have to destroy this place, Do-Yun said. All of it, even if it means we don't get out alive. The other soldiers nodded grimly. It was the only way to prevent a galactic catastrophe. But as they began setting charges around the chamber, alarms started echoing through the organic walls. The Devourers had realized what the rescue team was planning, and they were mobilizing every creature in the colony to stop them. How many? Thokvar asked Jin Woo. The human communications specialist was pale as he read his instruments. All of them. Every single devourer on the planet is coming here. We're talking about thousands of creatures. Kickstall looked around at the small rescue team. Even with their unexpected skills, there was no way they could fight off an entire army of devourers. We need to get the charges set and get out of here fast, he said. But Captain Do-Hyun was shaking his head, and that dangerous smile was back on his face. No, the human said quietly. We're going to stay and make sure they can't stop us. Kickstall stared at him in disbelief. That's suicide. We can't fight thousands of them. Do-Hyun looked at him with those calm, predator eyes. You can't, he agreed, but we can. The sound was getting louder. Through the organic walls of the central chamber, Kickstall could hear thousands of claws scraping against stone and metal. The chittering voices of the devourers echoed through the tunnels like an approaching storm. Every creature on the planet was coming to protect their breeding experiment. Charges are set, Sergeant Taemin reported. 20 minutes until detonation. That should be enough to bring down the entire facility. Thokvar was already moving toward the exit tunnels with the rescued colonists. Everyone out. We can make it to the landing zone if we move fast. But Captain Do-Hyun hadn't moved from his position near the breeding pit. His 4 soldiers stood around him in a loose circle, checking their weapons one final time. They looked calm, almost peaceful, as if they had made a decision that gave them comfort. Go, Do-Hyun told the other soldiers. Get the colonists to safety. We'll hold them here. Don't be ridiculous, Kickstall snapped. 5 soldiers can't hold off thousands of devourers. It's impossible. The human captain looked at him with those strange, calm eyes. Nothing is impossible. Some things just take longer than others. This is madness, Thokvar said. You'll all be killed. Private Haiwan spoke up for the first time in hours. Her voice was soft but steady. Maybe, but they won't get past us to stop those charges. Kickstall felt something cold settle in his stomach. These humans weren't planning a fighting retreat or a desperate last stand. They were planning to die here, and they seemed almost happy about it. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you do this?" Corporal Minho smiled, and for a moment he looked very young. "Because someone has to. And we're good at this kind of thing." "What kind of thing?" "Persistence hunting," Captain Do-hyun said simply. "You learn about it, you practice it, and eventually it becomes part of who you are." Before Kixtal could ask what that meant, the first wave of devourers broke through the tunnel entrances. They poured into the chamber like a black tide, hundreds of the creatures moving with perfect coordination. Their claws gleamed in the dim light, and their acid. Weapons dripped with hunger. "Go!" Do-hyun shouted to the retreating soldiers. "Now!" Kixtal wanted to stay and fight, but Thokvar grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the exit. The last thing he saw as they fled the chamber was the 5 humans spreading out into defensive positions, their weapons ready. The sound of battle followed them through the tunnels. Gunfire, explosions, the screaming of wounded devourers, and underneath it all, something that made Kixtal's skin crawl. The humans were making noise too, but it wasn't screaming or shouting orders. It was something else entirely, something that sounded almost like singing. The rescue team ran through the maze of tunnels, carrying the colonists they had saved from the cocoons. Behind them, the sounds of fighting grew louder instead of softer. Somehow, the battle was spreading throughout the chamber instead of ending quickly. "How are they still alive?" One of the Morphid soldiers gasped as they ran. Kixtal was wondering the same thing. 5 soldiers, no matter how skilled, should have been overwhelmed in seconds by that many enemies. But the gunfire continued, and the screaming of devourers never stopped. They had almost reached the surface when Private Jin Woo's voice crackled over the radio. "This is Jin Woo to Extraction Team. We're still operational, holding position at the breeding chamber." "How is that possible?" Thokvar demanded. There was a pause, filled with the sound of weapons fire and something that might have been laughter. "Turns. Out the devourers don't like enclosed spaces when they can't coordinate properly," Jin Woo replied. "Who would have thought?" "What do you mean?" "Oh, you know, block the main entrances, create choke points, force them to attack in small groups instead of one big wave. Basic persistence hunting tactics." Kixtal still didn't understand what persistence hunting meant, but he was beginning to realize that the humans had turned the Devourer's own tunnel system against them. Instead of facing thousands of enemies at once, they were fighting dozens at a time in carefully chosen positions. "How much longer can you hold?" Thokvar asked. "Long enough," Captain Do-hyun's voice cut in. "The charges detonate in 12 minutes. We'll keep them busy until then." "And after that?" There was another pause, longer this time. "After that, it won't matter," Do-hyun said quietly. Kixtal realized that the humans had never planned to escape. They had known from the beginning that someone would have to stay behind to make sure the charges weren't disarmed. They had chosen to sacrifice themselves to save everyone else. The rescue team reached the surface and began loading the colonists onto their transport. Through the ship's windows, Kixtal could see smoke rising from the entrances to the underground facility. The battle was still raging below, but it sounded different now. Less coordinated, more desperate. "What are they doing down there?" he asked Jin Woo over the radio. "Psychological warfare," the communications specialist replied, and Kixtal could hear the smile in his voice. "Turns out devourers are really bad at dealing with unpredictable behavior." "I don't understand." "Hive minds are great for coordination, but they don't handle chaos well. When you do things that don't make logical sense, It confuses them. They start making mistakes. As if to prove his point, there was a massive explosion from somewhere deep in the facility. Taemin's demolition charges were going off ahead of schedule, creating even more confusion among the Devourers. 5 minutes to main detonation, Do-hyun reported. You might want to get some distance. The transport lifted off and flew away from the colony as fast as it could. Kixtal watched through the rear windows as the facility grew smaller below them. Small explosions were still going off all across the complex, and he could see Devourers streaming out of exits throughout the area, but none of them were heading toward the central chamber where the humans were making their stand. Instead, they seemed to be fleeing in random directions, their usual coordination completely broken. "How?" Kixtal whispered. "Sir," one of the rescued colonists spoke up weakly. "I saw the humans training before the colony was attacked. They spent weeks studying videos of pack hunters from their homeworld. Wolves, they called them. They said the key was not to fight like soldiers, but to fight like predators." "What's the difference?" The colonist closed his eyes, exhausted. "Soldiers follow rules. Predators make their own rules." The main detonation lit up the entire horizon. The explosion was so massive that it shook their transport even from 20 miles away. When the light faded and the smoke cleared, there was nothing left of the mining colony except a crater in the ground. The Devourer army had been completely destroyed. Every single creature on the planet was dead, along with their breeding experiment and any chance they had of evolving into something even more dangerous. And somewhere in that crater were 5 human soldiers who had given their lives to make it happen. But as the transport flew toward the orbital ships, Kixtal heard something that made his blood freeze. It was Jinwoo's voice on the radio, weak but unmistakably alive. "This is the human squad to extraction team. We're still here." "Impossible," Thakvar breathed. "Nothing could have survived that explosion." "Funny thing about humans," Do-hyun's voice joined in, tired but amused. "We're really hard to kill when we don't want to die." Kixtal stared at the crater where the colony had been. Somehow, impossibly, the 5 humans had not only survived the battle against thousands of Devourers, they had lived through a nuclear-level explosion. "How?" was all he could manage to say. "We found some of the deeper tunnels," Haewon explained. "Taemin shaped the charges to blow upward and outward. We rode out the explosion in a reinforced area about half a mile down." "And the Devourers?" "All dead," Do-hyun confirmed. "Every single one. The hive-mind connection was severed when the breeding chamber was destroyed. Without coordination, they couldn't escape the blast zone." As rescue shuttles launched from the orbital ships to pick up the human squad, Kixtal sat in stunned silence. He had witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 5 soldiers had faced impossible odds and won, not through superior weapons or numbers, but through something far more terrifying. They had won by becoming something that even the Devourers couldn't understand or predict, something that followed no rules except the ancient law of predator and prey, and Kixtal was beginning to understand that he had never really seen what humans were capable of when they stopped pretending to be civilized. 3 days had passed since the mission to Kepler 442c, and Kixtal still couldn't sleep properly. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those 5 humans standing calmly in the face of certain death, smiling as if they knew a secret that no one else understood. The rescue shuttles had found them alive in the deep tunnels, exactly as they had said. They emerged from the crater dirty and tired, but otherwise unharmed. When asked how they had survived, Captain Do-hyun had simply said, "We prepared for the worst and hoped for the best." But Kixtal knew there was more to it than that. No one could have planned for what happened in that chamber. No amount of preparation could have allowed 5 soldiers to defeat thousands of devourers and survive a massive explosion. There was something about humans that went beyond normal military training. He had tried to dismiss it as luck or good tactics, but the more he thought about it, the more disturbed he became. The humans had fought like they understood the devourers, better than the creatures understood themselves. They had predicted every move, countered every strategy, and turned the enemy's greatest strengths into weaknesses. Now, sitting in his quarters aboard the transport ship heading home, Kixtal decided to do some research. The ship's computer had access to the Galactic database, which contained information about every known species. He had never bothered to look up detailed information about humans before, but after what he had witnessed, he needed to understand what he was dealing with. The basic facts were familiar. Humans came from a planet called Earth in a small star system on the edge of the galaxy. They had only achieved space flight recently and were considered a minor species by galactic standards. Their technology was adequate, but not impressive. Their military was small and had no major victories against serious opponents. But as Kixtal dug deeper into their history, he found information that made his hands shake. Humans were persistence hunters. The term appeared over and over in the biological and anthropological reports. Kixtal had never heard of such a thing, so he read the definition carefully. Persistence hunting was a method of hunting where predators chased their prey over long distances until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. It required incredible endurance, patience, and the ability to track targets across any terrain. Most importantly, it required a mindset that could focus on a single goal for hours, days, or even weeks without giving up. The reports described how early humans had hunted animals, much larger and stronger than themselves. They didn't use superior strength or speed. Instead, they simply followed their prey relentlessly, never stopping, never giving up, until the target was too tired to run anymore. But that wasn't the worst part. As Kixtal read further, he discovered that humans had used the same tactics against each other throughout their history. When they went to war, they didn't just fight battles. They wore down entire civilizations through constant pressure and endless determination. The reports included examples that made Kixtal's blood run cold. Humans had fought wars that lasted for decades or even centuries. They had survived ice ages, plagues, and natural disasters that should have wiped them out completely. When faced with extinction, they didn't accept defeat. They adapted, evolved, and came back stronger. Most terrifying of all, they had domesticated other predators. While every other known species had either been killed by the dangerous animals on their planet or had learned to avoid them, humans had somehow convinced wolves to become their allies. They had turned their most dangerous enemies into loyal companions through methods that no other species fully understood. The more Kixtal read, the more he realized that he had been completely wrong about humans. They weren't weak or harmless. They were apex predators disguised as a civilized species. Their calm behavior and polite manners weren't signs of weakness. They were the self-control of creatures who knew exactly how dangerous they could be. He thought about the battle in the Devourer facility. The humans hadn't fought like soldiers following orders or warriors seeking glory. They had fought like hunters who had found the perfect prey. They had been patient, methodical, and absolutely ruthless in their efficiency. The Devourers, for all their hive-mind coordination and biological advantages, had made a fatal mistake. They had treated humans like all the other species they had encountered, victims to be consumed. But humans weren't victims. They were predators who had been hunting things far more dangerous than devourers for millions of years. Kixtal realized that the humans' strange preparation before the mission now made perfect sense. They hadn't been acting unprofessional. They had been bonding as a pack. The personal items they shared, the quiet conversations, the ritual with their hands in a circle, it was all part of preparing for a hunt. And when the hunt began, they had reverted to something far older than their civilized personas. They had become what their ancestors were, persistence hunters who never gave up, never showed mercy, and never stopped until their prey was dead. The most chilling part was how easily they had switched back to being polite, calm soldiers afterward. There had been no battle rage to cool down from, no emotional aftermath to deal with. They had simply completed their hunt and returned to their civilized behavior as if nothing had happened. Kixtal found a section in the database about human military doctrine that made everything even worse. Human strategists didn't plan for quick victories or glorious battles. They planned for long campaigns where they could gradually wear down their enemies through constant pressure. They called it attrition warfare, but Kixtal recognized it as persistence hunting on a galactic scale. When humans went to war, they didn't just want to defeat their enemies. They wanted to make sure those enemies could never threaten anyone again. They fought with a patience and determination that could last for generations if necessary. He thought about the Galactic Council's decision to invite humans into their alliance. At the time, it had seemed like a charitable gesture toward a young species that needed protection. Now Kixtal realized it might have been the most important decision in galactic history. The Council hadn't just gained new allies, they had allied themselves with the most successful predator species ever discovered. Humans had survived everything their hostile planet could throw at them, and they had done it not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. If humans ever decided that the galactic civilization was a threat to their survival, Kixtal realized that no amount of advanced technology or military might would be enough to stop them. They would simply adapt, persist, and gradually wear down their enemies until nothing was left. But there was another possibility that was almost as terrifying. What if humans decided that some other species needed to be eliminated for the good of the galaxy? What if they applied their persistence hunting instincts to a larger target? Kixtal remembered Captain Do-Hyun's words in the Devourer facility. Nothing is impossible. Some things just take longer than others. That wasn't the philosophy of a soldier or even a warrior. That was the mindset of a predator who had learned that patience was the ultimate weapon. Humans could wait for years, decades, or centuries if necessary. They could pursue a goal across multiple generations, never forgetting, never giving up, never showing mercy. The Devourers had learned this lesson too late. They had treated humans like prey, but humans had never been prey in their entire evolutionary history. They had always been the hunters, the ones that other creatures learned to fear. Now they were loose in the galaxy, allied with the Galactic Council and slowly learning about every species and their weaknesses. They were studying military tactics, technology, and political systems with the same patient attention they had once used to track animals across vast distances. Kixtal closed the database files and sat in his dark quarters, staring at the stars, outside his window. Somewhere out there, humans were preparing for whatever came next. They were learning, adapting, and planning with the infinite patience of creatures who had never met a problem they couldn't eventually solve. The really terrifying Part was that they seemed to genuinely want peace and cooperation with other species. But Kixtal now understood that human definitions of peace might be very different from what everyone else expected. When humans decided that something was a threat, they didn't just neutralize it. They eliminated it so completely that it became a cautionary tale. They did it calmly, methodically, and with a thoroughness that ensured the problem would never return. The Devourers were gone, not just defeated or driven away, but completely extinct. Every single creature on that planet had died, along with their breeding experiments and any chance of the species recovering. Kixtal had witnessed the birth of a legend that would spread throughout the galaxy. The story of 5 human soldiers, who faced impossible odds and won through methods that no one fully understood. But he was one of the few beings who knew the truth. It hadn't been impossible at all. It had just been humans doing what they had always done best, hunting something until it was dead, then going home to tell stories about it. And now everyone in the galaxy would learn what the Devourers had learned. Too late. Humans were not the harmless newcomers they appeared to be. They were persistent predators in a universe full of prey.